Hey all.
What's the magic number, Laura? When do we start? What number on the screen?
I think somewhere in the 50s or 60s.
Okay, I like it.
Yeah, let's just randomly see what we can get to.
Okay. Hi everybody who's joining. We're watching the number tick in. We're just trying to make sure we have most people on.
Right. Looks like it's pausing.
Oh, we got a plateau.
I think that might be the plateau.
All right.
Oh, nope.
I think we're safe though, in the
Okay.
spirit of time. Hi
Right.
everybody. I'm Andrea Bien. I'm a clinical assistant professor in elementary and literacy ed at BU Wheelock.
And my name is Dr. Laura Jimenez, and I am the department chair of language and literacy here at BU Wheelock, which is always a surprise to me because somebody put me in charge of something rather large and impressive. What we're going to do today basically is we're going to talk about mis and underrepresented identities in children's literature. So this is going to be focused on literature. We're hoping to have another webinar maybe in a month or two. You know, time doesn't matter anymore, right? Really focusing on implementation in the classroom. The one thing that Andrea and I do well is I do the children's literature side. She does the implementation side. I do also, but together we make a really good team. To start off, I always, oh yes, go ahead.
Before Laura's going to share her identities, we're going to do that, but we should tell people before this is being recorded. So we want to let people know that. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Laura. Also, there will be time for Q&A at the end. We're hoping to leave about 15 minutes, and there's the Q&A feature in Zoom that folks can use. So I just wanted to make sure people knew that logistical stuff before we got into it. So hit it, Dr. Jimenez.
Good one, Dr. Bien. So when I start talking, I always want to share what we call, our identities. As an egghead scholar, we talk about our positionality, right? But I want y'all to know, so I am a white presenting, which means I look white, right? I walk this big white face into a room. Nobody's, expecting the following name. My name is Laura Maria Jimenez. I'm waiting for the interpreter to spell it, right? Excellent. I'm a Latina lesbian, so longtime lesbian, been a lesbian, according to my mom, since I came out. She mentions that I tried to hit on one of the nurses. So I have a learning disability and I'm dyslexic. So of course I study children's literature. That's a one-to-one correlation. And I really do this work because of my own experiences in school of not seeing myself, almost any aspect of myself represented in literature, and never seeing a Latina lesbian until I was 47 or 48. That's way too long. So, Andrea?
Yeah, so I'm Andrea Bien, and I am white. I am cis, heterosexual, middle class. I am sort of the archetype of the elementary school teacher in America. I come from a really different perspective than than Laura does. And I think that's actually maybe one of the reasons that we make a good team, because I really feel strongly that mis and underrepresentation of underrepresented, marginalized identities in children's literature is not a problem of the marginalized people. It's just a people problem, right? This is an issue that white people need to contend with. We have an overwhelming number of white teachers in the field. And so I do share a lot of my identities with sort of your typical teacher that's in US schools. But I hope that what I can bring is a way to help white teachers think about how to analyze children's literature and grapple with some of what we know in terms of like the interconnected problems in terms of who shows up on the pages of children's books. It's not only just the characters, but also what are the stories that get told and who gets left out and whose stories are not told. So that's me. So you want me to start? Cool. All right. Skippyjon, no. I just want to say really quickly that this is my attempt at being funny. And that Skippyjon, no, is a play on Skippyjon Jones, which is, for some people may know, Skippyjon Jones is the title character in this wildly popular children's book series. There are like 20 books in the series. Some of them have been #1 on best-selling charts. Skippyjon is a Siamese cat who I guess thinks he's a Chihuahua. And as we talk today, it will become clear how Skippyjon made his way into the title of a talk that's about mis and underrepresentation of Black and Indigenous people of color in children's literature. So you'll see him. He will appear later. But for now, let me give you some information up front about what we mean by mis and underrepresentation to kind of break down the problems that Laura and I are addressing today. Let me see if I can get these. Oh, those are our Twitter handles too, by the way, if that's a thing that you're interested in. Okay, so here's our interconnected problems. We have this problem of underrepresentation of historically marginalized communities in children's literature. So what does that mean? It means that the number of characters in children's literature who represent any marginalized group, right? So it may be race, ethnicity, gender, sexual identity, ability. The number of these characters in children's literature is less than the actual number of human beings in the world that belong to these groups. Okay, there are fewer Black, Indigenous, queer, disabled characters in children's books than there are in our world. And so I'll show you some numbers in a minute to back that up. But one thing that this is why I want to emphasize as we start to think about what this means, that this is not a person of color problem. If kids are growing up at home where they're reading, in school where they're reading, and they're seeing an over-representation of whiteness and an underrepresentation of non-whiteness, this is a contribution to the normalization of whiteness as the supreme, right? The top of a hierarchy. But token representation is not the goal. Okay, so this is where we start to think about misrepresentation. It's this related problem. What we often see in children's books is the inclusion of characters who are meant to represent the marginalized groups that are often, if not typically, excluded. They end up in these sort of narrow, stereotypical, and actually harmful portrayals, right? So we'll give some examples of this. And I just want to also say that we're not only going to give examples of this, I should have said this at the beginning, but we're going to provide some tools for how anybody, a parent who reads at home with their kids, a teacher who's working in classrooms with kids, anybody who uses books can use some tools to be able to discern between, what is an authentic representation and what is a misrepresentation that's problematic and potentially harmful. Because the authentic representations are what we're going for. So we want to help people find those, right? There's a third issue here, which is on the bottom of the screen, which is the limiting representation, these limiting narratives. So briefly, some of the best examples I think of this are visible during February, during Black History Month. We see stories of slavery. We read endlessly biographies of Ruby Bridges, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. These are everywhere, and these are important historical moments. And so this isn't to minimize that, but the problem is that it just limits the portrayal of the Black experience to slavery, right? Or to the civil rights movement. These are not the only stories to tell. So even though some of them may be authentic, they may not be misrepresentations, it's still limiting. And so we know we can do better. We know that there are more stories to tell. There are more characters that we want to see on the pages of books. So here are the numbers that I promised. This is from 2015. In 2015, 73.3%, 2015, yep, 23.3% of the characters in children's books were white. Let's let that sink in for a second. That's a lot. It's a huge number.
And overwhelmingly male.
And overwhelmingly male. Perhaps even more disturbing, 12.5 are either animals or just inanimate objects. Okay? So we can do, I'll do the math for you real quick. 73.3 plus 12.5 is almost 86% of the characters in children's books are either white males or animals or, Laura's favorite, talking trains. So by sheer numbers alone, you can see why we say there's an underrepresentation, right? We'll talk about this small percentage that's left for First Nation, Latinx, Asian, African American stories. And because then we want to look at those and see, and which one of those are authentic, right? But these are problematic numbers.
But wait, Dr. Bien, hasn't it gotten better?
Funny, you should ask, Laura. The good news is that in 2017 or 2018, it's covered on my screen. It's 2018. As I say, I think they do this every 3 years. So next year we'll look and see, right, for these numbers. But here's where we are right now. In 2018, the number of white characters actually declined, right? So we go from this 73%, where almost 3/4 of the characters in children's literature are white. The number actually declines, so that in 2018, only about half of the characters are white. That number is not what you think, because as you can see, we have put this giant red circle around the animals and the inanimate objects, and that number more than doubled. So the overall number actually of like what's left for anybody who's not white or a talking train is really small, right? So the good news is that there was an increase in African American characters, in Asian characters, in Latinx characters, but we're in the next slides, we're going to start to talk about what are some of those stories that are getting told. Like the numbers tell us something, they don't tell us everything. And so I just want you to sort of let it sink in for a second that a child who identifies as non-white has less a chance of seeing themselves in a picture book than a walking, talking train. That's super important. But what's also important is that we are raising children to think that the world is 77% white people and talking trains, right? And we know that that's not our society. That's not the world that we live in. So not only can non-white students struggle to see themselves on the pages of books, but we're raising white kids to think that their story is the only story that is centered predominantly.
So we want to take a look at some examples of this kind of stuff. So we thought we'd start with misrepresentations, because those are fairly easy to see or to point to. So one of the big ones, we're talking a lot about the representation of African American and Black people in children's literature because it should be at the forefront of our thinking. But by no means are any other marginalized communities represented any better, right? So just so you know that, I'm not saying like we blow it on the African American and Black folks, but Latinx, we're great. We're not, okay? But there's this idea of a smiling slave narrative, and it's a horrible narrative. And it is this idea that enslaved people were happy to be enslaved, and they were happy to have to live in these circumstances, and they were happy with the situation of being enslaved by white people. I mean, it's another thing, we never talk about who's doing the enslavement, but that's a different webinar. So two books that came up immediately when we were talking about this is A Fine Dessert by Emily Jenkins and Sophie Blackhall. In the Fine Dessert, it is a book written to sort of follow the historical track of this dessert called, I think it was a blueberry fool or a raspberry fool, a berry sort of cobbler dish. But as you can see, when they get to America, they place it on a plantation. This is antebellum South. And they give you this look of this wonderful dinner and these people enjoying their dessert. And you'll notice there's a young African-American boy that's fanning them. You'll see that house slaves are serving this white family. And then if you look in the corner, after the cook, who is also an enslaved woman, prepares the dessert, she and her daughter hide in a linen closet in order to enjoy the remnants of it, not even cooked, just the remnants of it. And they're smiling, they're happy about that. Another one that was really problematic, came out very similar time, is A Birthday Cake for George Washington. That was a biography of a chef that belonged to, that George Washington owned, because he was a slave owner, right? And his cook. And the only thing that this man was interested in, the thing that was going to make his life better, was to make the perfect birthday cake for George Washington. And again, it was him working with his daughter in the kitchen to appease his white owner. This is that idea of a smiling slave narrative, and it comes up too often to be coincidental. Right. And then another aspect of misrepresentation that we don't often talk about is erasure, just wholesale erasure. So Stonewall was a picture book that I think a lot of us were very excited about seeing, because we don't see a lot of our LGBTQIA history, especially in picture books. And so we're all very excited by it. And then when I read it, I became less and less enamored with the book, because it whitewashed the experience of Stonewall. Now, I was not at Stonewall, although some people might think I was old enough for that, but I wasn't. Also, I was on the West Coast, whatever. But what it does is it shows the initial uprising as that being started by a young woman, a young white woman in a sort of a nice page boy cut. Even though historically we know that Stormy, Sylvia, and Marcia were the people that began protesting and started, Stormy is credited with throwing the first brick. That's historical fact. This is not something that we want to think about. And she is what they called a stone butch. She's a butch lesbian. Right? And Sylvia Rivera and Marcia Johnson were trans women of color. All of these were women of color. And by erasing that and making it neutral, as the author wanted to defend his actions, right? They wanted to make it neutral and tell the story of the event. You are practicing erasure. That's another way of misrepresenting.
Can I add something, Laura?
Always.
Yeah, I think I just want to highlight something that you're saying here, which is there's this misrepresenting the people, and there's misrepresenting the story, right? There may be a misrepresentation in terms of enslaved people being overjoyed to serve dessert to white families. That's a misrepresentation of the character's experience. There's also, I think, commonly this misrepresentation of the story, right? And that's where we get into like the rewriting of history.
I think that's a really good point.
Thank you.
So then there's the limiting, right? So we've got this idea of stereotypical tropes, right? We've got this idea of historical erasure, right? And now we want to talk about this limiting. And this is a little harder, because what this does is it gives us what literature scholars call a grand narrative, right? So in other words, it has one story arc. You know, you can think of it as a single story. For African Americans in America, the single story, the grand narrative is enslavement. No one is at fault ever. It's just enslavement. Poof, they arrived, right? And then Lincoln came in to fix everything. Again, white savior, right? And then nothing happened. And then civil rights, which doesn't make any sense because if everything was fine, why did we think, but I digress, right? And then it sort of like moves into urban decay. That's the grand narrative that we have. And I think Andrea, you call it holidays and heroes.
Yeah,
The
I
only
mean,
time
I get that. Ooh, I apologize to the interpreters. The heroes and holidays comes from a lot of the research on curriculum and teaching in classrooms, and so I just want I do call it that, but that's not my phrase. So I'd be clear about that.
Right. And so this holiday and heroes, again, the history might be correct. The importance of these people is absolutely correct, right? The need for this to be in the classroom is absolutely correct. The problem is we only see this in the 28 days of February, right? And Joel Christian Gill, who wrote Strange Fruit, he writes graphic novels featuring African American stories. You know, he started the hashtag 28 days is not enough, right? We need to be reading these narratives across the year, right? And we need to read other narratives that are not only about trauma and right and yeah, trauma. You need to read stuff that's not just trauma. Yeah.
So the good news is, I know this is like kind of a downer, right? Is to have to tell you all that so much children's literature is totally racist and homophobic, and you know, it's not all doom and gloom. We have some tools that are really, I think, empowering and enable us to make better choices about the texts that we choose to use with kids, whether it's in school or out of school. So we're going to talk about 3 of them today. And I'm saying 3 because 2 of them sort of fall under this one umbrella of critical literary analysis. We have a way of doing a quantitative analysis where we frequency count, which we're going to talk about. And then there's a qualitative analytic process, which is really about looking for stereotypes, trying to surface our own thoughts about stereotypes and our own assumptions about groups, whether it's an ethnic or racial group, it's a gender group. So we'll talk about those 2 processes. The one that I'm going to talk about right now is the Bechdel test applied to children's literature. So here's the story with the Bechdel test. This is the way that it sort of started was for film, I believe. Is that no? It was women. It was literature, but then it's also youth and film, right? Alison Bechdel.
Yeah. So she wrote a comic called "Dykes to Watch Out For."
Yeah.
Right. Because I think we should say that again. She wrote a comic titled "Dykes to Watch Out For"
in the 80s. Yeah. So it's this test is named after her, but it's also been used, it's been applied to movies, television, because here's what it is that you find 2 named women in, let's focus right now on children's literature. So you're looking for 2 women in a children's book who are named. Okay, there's a challenge, maybe. And then you want to look at what they're doing, what they're talking about, essentially. Do they speak to each other? And do they speak to each other about something other than a man? And so you can do this test with women, but you can do it with any marginalized identity, right? You could say, are there 2 queer characters? Do they talk to each other? Do they talk to each other about anything other than straight people, right? Are there 2 Black characters? Are they named? Do they speak to each other? Do they speak to each other about something other than white people? And then we could also get into intersectionality. right? Are there Black women? Are there Black queer women, right? And so I love this. I love this test because it is so simple. It's like a simple exercise that anybody can do. And what it highlights for us is the frequency with which stories in children's books, but also we know television, movies, really privilege this dominant narrative that is white, male, heterosexual, middle class. And it really points to the way that women and other marginalized identities are so often supporting caste, and that their inclusion in books is really just to prop up the dominant narrative. That's the purpose that women, people of color, queer people serve in children's literature, is they're there to prop up this dominant narrative. And so it's again this just exclusion, and it can be hard. It can be really hard. It can be overwhelming to pick up a stack of books and try to figure out which of these books are the right books and which of these books am I going to do harm if I use, right? So I love this one because it's a really simple exercise that you can do, and it'll change the way that you read everything and consume everything. Do you want to add anything, Laura?
So I think it's important. Anita Sarkeesian, she's the feminist frequency scholar down in New York. I think she's at Columbia. But she makes a point to say this is not a measure of quality. This is a measure of representation. You can have a great movie, right? You can have a singular movie that does not have any female characters, and it can be a great movie. The problem is when you look at it, like you suggested, look at it across, right? Look at it across a spectrum, look at it across all the media you are consuming. That's when they go sideways fast.
Yeah. Yeah, it's about the pattern across books, the pattern across movies. And children are exposed to books constantly at home and in school. And when we start to do this, we can start to maybe figure out, oh, I haven't read a book to my first graders in 6 months that's anything other than an animal or a male white character. And I don't have women that are talking to each other about anything meaningful.
So this is sort of this is the next step.
Yeah.
This is the master's level. This is the now we're really going to get into it. I admittedly teach this. I have not written about it yet, and I need to. And Andrea's going to help me. So the quantitative analysis, keep track of this, right? So authorship, who's writing the book? Who is presenting this narrative? I like to show a predominance of own voices in my classes. And own voices are texts that are written by and about a marginalized community, right? Who's telling the story? Okay, whose story is being told? I am convinced that it takes extra effort for people outside of the community to tell a story about a marginalized community. It can be done, but it takes a lot of work, and I'm not sure people are really in it to do that work. The other thing to do is to go through the book, literally counting the number and variety of characters. All right. And so if you go through, one of my very favorite books is Lumberjanes. Okay. Because if you go through that book, it's predominantly female characters, but there are a fair number of male characters, right? Race, class, ability, it's all represented across that book. There is no predominant, except for gender, right? There are more women characters in that. There is no predominant representation. Which I really love about those books, right? So count who's there, count who speaks. In a study that I did with one of our grad students, we looked across graphic novels that had female protagonists. Men still spoke more, had more dialogue than women in those graphic novels. And, you know, half of them were written by women. This isn't about necessarily, it's not about who's writing it. I think that is a place to start, right? But it is not a guaranteed, all right? Then you go on to step 2. And this requires you to deeply read the book. You have to identify the characters in the book that represent marginalized identities. Sometimes I talk about like tracking who is the most vulnerable, right? Then you have to do some self-work. What are the stereotypes that you know about? You might not hold them, it may not be what you think, but you are aware of them. You've got to get that, right? You got to, and I suggest you write it down, maybe on a whiteboard so you can get rid of it right away.
Yeah, Laura has come into my classes and she has the students use Post-its, right? Writing down everything, every prevailing stereotype about that community. They don't need, then here's a nice thing. It's what are the prevailing stereotypes, right? You may not hold them, but also it's a real opportunity for you to get like a little real with yourself about your own assumptions and biases, because we all have them. And write them down. But the reason I say this is then Laura will probably tell you to immediately, when the activity is done, crumple them up and light them on fire so that they don't get into the hands of someone else and be mistaken for something that they are not.
Although I have been warned that we can't have open fire in our classrooms. So that's, you know.
I believe that you have been warned of this, actually.
So then you need to read the book looking specifically for occurrences of those stereotypes. The more you find, the more problematic the book probably is. And again, this isn't like an automatic, you find one and you're done. This is a predominance issue, right? And then watch who's centered in the book. Watch whose experience is most valued. I think one of the books that when you go through this exercise becomes heartbreak for the readers is Wonder by R.J. Palacio. Because in that book, Augie is not centered. Augie does not change. Augie's experiences are not valued. It is about the world around him. And he is only there to change the characters around him. He is there to function very much like the magical black man trope to fix the white people. Augie is there as somebody with a physical disability there to fix the non-disabled people around him. And that is all he is there for.
So another way to think about this, like we've used this language of who is centered and who is most valued, but sort of maybe like the deficit way of saying this. I think this is why we shy away from it, but it is another way to think about it is there a group that's being exploited for the betterment of the dominant group? Right. So I think the magical black man trope, and in this case, Augie and Wonder, their role is being exploited for the betterment of the group that already has privilege.
Exactly. So we did want to bring it back to Skippyjon.
Here we go.
Here we go, people. You ready? You ready? My students often say that I'm here to ruin everything. Sort of like Erin ruins everything for children's literature, which I'm okay with. All right, so we're going to walk you through this. So Skippyjon Jones is an anthropomorphized animal. Okay, if you take a look, you take a 45 seconds on Google, you will find that Judy Scheckner is a white, straight, cis woman. Okay, she is not a Siamese cat. All right. And for those 2 or 3 people that are not familiar with Skippyjon, I wanted to give a little thumbnail sketch. Skippyjon is a Siamese cat that he always gets in trouble in the beginning of the book. He gets sent to his room, and then when he's in his room, he bounces on his bed. As he's bouncing on his bed, he sees his reflection in a mirror, and he always yells, holy guacamole, and I am going to say this way, holy guacamole, right? And he says he becomes Skippyjo Frisquito, who is a Chihuahua, and he emerges in some random desert to meet up with a group, gang, if you will, a gang of Chihuahuas called Los Chimichangos. Okay. And he refers to speaking in his very best Spanish accent. And he says, my ears are too big for my head. Right. And he continues with that. Do you want to talk a little bit about the image that I've got up here, Andrea?
Sure. So, I mean, it's funny to listen to Laura give this, because to me, it's like, and we rest our case, right?
Yeah.
We need to say nothing more. But when you look at, so like we've included one page out of one of the Skippyjon books, and you can see that the animals are wearing sombreros, right? As if this is how Mexican people walk around their lives, is wearing sombreros. It is this gang of Chihuahuas. So you see Skippyjon there in the middle in his bandito mask, surrounded by Chihuahuas, and naturally they're in this desert setting, having a fiesta. So if we are thinking as teachers, or we are thinking as parents who are going to be reading this book with students, and we want to engage in this process of what are all the stereotypes that exist about Mexicans? Laura's covering her face, because it's almost like you look at this page and you're like, oh, yep, there they all are, right? The idea that you have this gang of little Chihuahuas and they're all wearing sombreros and they only exist in some desert, right? Just any sort of unnamed desert, partying.
Exactly.
Partying.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's just what this book is doing. It may be trying to be playful and cute, but what it is actually doing, right, is reinforcing every stereotype. Not every, but many of the stereotypes of like the bad hombre, right?
I think
Yeah.
a lot of the love for Skippyjon Jones is around language play, right? And so I wanted to really, in no uncertain terms, let's be incredibly clear here. Fake Spanish is a racist act.
Yeah.
That's it. There we are. It's not Spanglish. It's not Spanish. It is, in fact, a racist act. And so the fact that they basically just add O to everything, or Ito to everything, right? And then they use things like Machu Picchu, which is a spiritual, holy, archaeologically, culturally important site, as a password. It's insulting.
It's insulting. Yeah.
Okay, so this is racist. Straight up. So let's not give them any more time. Let's talk about some books that we like.
We love so many books.
So many books.
We love books. Yeah, representations of joy.
How about that?
Yeah, one of the things that that Laura spoke to earlier is this idea of, so often the stories that feature marginalized characters who belong to marginalized communities, right? Whose identities represent a marginalized community or communities. So often the story is only of struggle, right? Struggle is important, resilience is important, right? But people are people who experience joy all the time, and those stories should be told. And so there are examples of these. Alma and How She Got Her Name, may be familiar to some. Jabari Jumps. Jabari Jumps, by the way, if you teach young children and you do like small moments writing, I highly recommend Jabari Jumps. It's just a really sweet, lovely story. And the little boy happens to be Black. It's not about his Blackness, right? It's about a Black boy experiencing this sort of milestone event, right? Where he jumps off the high jump or the diving board.
And the strange thing, and here's the thing, I wonder if Jabari Jumps is actually about Blackness, because there is a history of segregation of African Americans and Latinos against having them in public pools. So it's sort of like it sort of gets at this, but it really is a representation of him being proud of being able to jump off this high dive, being able to swim, being able to do all this stuff. So it's a sort of a nice, it nods to that, but it's not the focus.
And you know what? And thanks for saying that, because it was when I said earlier, if you ever teach small moments with young writers, first grade writers, Jabari Jumps is such a wonderful mentor text for this, in part because sometimes the pushback with certain children's book and certain children's literature can be that we need to rely on a canon of some sort, right? And that we need to default to white writers, to white characters for a whole set of reasons that exist in the world that we don't need to get into right now. But the thing that I love about this book and about many of these books that we'll talk about is that these are the books that can do both. This is a mentor text for small moments writing about a little boy who happens to be Black. You can use it that way. It is maybe also a commentary on the historical segregation of pools. There's so many ways that this book could be a metaphor, but it can also be a book that you include in your classroom so that you disrupt the constant normalization of only seeing white kids in children's literature. So I think that's what's really powerful about some of these, is that you're using books in your classroom for all different purposes, and so often it's to teach something about reading comprehension or about writing craft. And so you can use these books for those purposes. It doesn't always have to be about including texts because you have a specific explicit social justice goal. It's actually just shifting the texts that you choose and the representations that you make available in your classroom, so that the norm is that we're constantly seeing the diversity in our books that we see in our world.
And I think I want to give a big shout out to Fry Bread, because Fry Bread was written because Kevin Millard, who is the author, who is African American, and I do not remember what nation he's from, and he's Indigenous as well. He could not find a book for his kids that represented his Indigenous, right, experience, and he wanted that to exist in the world, so he wrote it himself. Right? We want more of these stories. They got to stop being the exception, and they need to start being the norm. Right? And there's still the importance of survival. There's still the importance of perseverance. There's still the importance of getting through day to day and getting through horrific, traumatic, culturally colonizing events, right? And so we aren't saying not to have these in your room, but I would prefer to have these centered as part of your curriculum, especially in predominantly white classes. All right. I think When We're Alone is a fabulous book by David Robertson and Julia Flett, and it shows the damage wrought by the Indian boarding schools. We need a different word than Indian boarding schools, because they for sure weren't run by Native Americans, right? But the American, right, effort to completely destroy Native American culture in this country. And it gives that in a very kid-friendly, understandable way. And I love that book. And the great thing is that a lot of kids can reflect on it and recognize modern day policing of Black and brown bodies, right, in what was done to Native Americans. So it's, again, like you said, it's just a really good story. So we have resources. We told you, here they are. And I believe that Mary Ellen will be sending these out, so you don't have to, copy them down. You will get them if you signed on to this webinar, right, you'll get them. But I think I want to just shout out one of them is absolutely social justice books. You can go on that website and they have different, you can look at different subject matters, and all of those books, they are culled, the reviews are culled from the internet from people like me who write reviews. And so that's my one big, I want to make sure that people take a look at that. Do you want to?
And I'm going to say one more thing before, and we actually we really nailed it with time. And I'm
good about that.
Perfectly honest, I'm shocked because I know Laura and I'm shocked, but we really did. But the one thing I'll say before we go to the Q&A is that Lee and Low is a publisher. And I think, and so this list of resources is a great list of resources that includes sort of lots of different organizations, people, right? There's blogs, there's like Teaching Tolerance is on here, the Zin Project, but Lee and Low is a publisher. And I have found over the recent years, as I've learned more about this, is that it's also really helpful to know who are the publishers publishing the good books, because I want to support them. Right. And so there's the publishing industry is powerful, and they certainly contribute to who's represented and who's not. And so I just wanted to give a shout out to Lee and Low.
Okay, so we do have some, I'm gonna, Andrea, do you see the chat? I'm sorry, the Q&A?
I do now because I just unmuted, or I unshared, sorry. So now I can see it.
The first Q&A, and I'm gonna look through the chat and see what I can find in the chat.
Yeah, let's see. So here's the question, brainstorming here. I think girls talking to girls about something other than boys used to be easier. Anne of Green Gables and Diane discussing art and poetry. Oh, Nancy Drew and her pals solving crimes. One of her pals was an early lesbian-like person. Do kids read these books anymore? You know what? That's a great question. Do they read Anne of Green Gables and Nancy Drew? I mean, I think it's dwindling, if I'm going to be honest.
I think Anne of Green Gables is still being read in the classroom because teachers, especially white women teachers, can't let it go.
Okay, well, I love Anne of Green Gables.
Which is what I'm saying. I was never interested in it. I thought it was
there's the Netflix show, somebody just said. Yeah. But this is such an interesting point, Julie, that has the narrative changed, right? Do we find that now what is being featured in books is more, these are all, yeah. Well, but you know what though? But so this is, it's okay. It's okay. She says they're privileged white girls, and they are, but it's so complex, and this is where intersectionality comes in, right? Is that women are typically an underrepresented group, right? But there's other groups that, it's not just women, but women of color especially. And so kind of thinking about the complexity of identities and who's in books and who isn't is really important. Tell me about this, Laura, that you're holding up.
So if you want an alternative to Nancy Drew, Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur, African-American woman who is the smartest person in the entire Marvel universe, including smarter than Tony, what's his name, Iron Man. There. Also, I did read Nancy Drew. And it was because I thought she was a closet lesbian, and I was very worried she was going to have sustained head injuries because she was always getting knocked out and stuffed in trunks. I'm just going to call out Nancy Drew.
Yes, well, maybe, okay. There's so many things I want to say to that, but I'm going to let it go because there's amazing things happening in the chat. Somebody commented that Jabari Jumps is written by a white woman. And thank you for saying that, because that's right. And I think that's why Laura and I, when we were thinking about the quantitative analysis and the qualitative analysis and how to think about going through this in a quick webinar, it's this really iterative process, which is who wrote it, right? Is it written by a person who shares an identity with the main character? Yes or no, right? And in this case, it's no. But
Right.
when we start to do some of the other analysis about our stereotypes about Black boys, right? And the experiences of Black boys, it does pass some of the tests. And so the tests, right? So yeah, so that's an interesting case of like, because we also have instances of own voices texts that are also totally racist,
Right.
right? And
Exactly.
so
The idea of, oh, sorry. So
go.
own voices is one way to look at. It is not a guarantee of quality. And I think the problem is that we've gotten used to Black, Indigenous, people of color writing absolutely extraordinary books. I mean, if you look at a lot of the awards given in the last 3 years, a lot of them have been given to Black, Indigenous people of color. And the reason is not because of payback, which a lot of people have thought about. It's because in order to get through the gauntlet of publishing, they have to be extraordinary. There are no middle of the roads. So yeah. Yes, I do think that you should actually recycle your Skippyjon Jones books, or use them to teach your kids about critical literacy. Teach them about, right? They can be used for that. I love that idea. I will not be setting them on fire. That is a terrible precedent.
Yeah.
Right.
There's a question here. Many of my students have the impression that Spanish is the indigenous language of the Americas. Do you have books that would help us explain that there were peoples here before Spanish? The Canadians do this a bit better than we do here in the States, more first people narratives. We often don't go back further than Spanish, giving mistaken impression that Hispanics were the first people. That's a great question. Do you have books, Laura, that help explain that there were people here before the Spanish?
Duncan, hold on. Keep talking.
Watch this. Laura's going to go pull out like 4 books from a shelf. Thank you for all these questions, by the way. While she's grabbing a book to answer Julie's question, please feel free to add more. Oh, Maria, did you raise your hand?
Oh, excellent. So Duncan, what is his last name? Tanatui. All of his work reflects Mayan and Azteca knowledge. And he's got a couple of books that I would just go look at all of his books. That's what I would do.
Maybe you could type his name into the chat, Laura, so people can spell it to Google him. Yeah, we have a few more minutes if there's any other questions, or you can open the chat up.
Yep.
Thank you.
Right. And then there's some other ones that I have to look at. We can include that though. I know there's a few. And you're right. I do feel like Indigenous folks in the Americas have done, and when I say that, I am particularly talking about Native folks have done a better job of getting stuff published. It's not that we're not writing, it's that it's, again, getting it through the gauntlet. I think Two Books has a couple of books, and it's TU with an accente, not two. So it's two, TU, with an accente over the U. Perfect. Yeah. All right. So
there's a new question in the Q&A. Sorry, I'm reading the chat and it's like people are sharing resources. So how would you recommend a public library implement these practices?
I'm going to say I have no idea because I'm not in library science. I'm going to punt that.
Do you find, here's a question that Laura and I are going to have like a little dialogue back and forth here for a second. This is a complicated one, right? Because we want libraries to offer all books, essentially, right?
Yeah.
But we want libraries to have like an awareness about what's getting showcased, profiled, recommended. But I think, Laura, is it the case that library scientists often are more progressive in this area than teachers? No, okay. And I say that as a teacher and a teacher educator. That's like, I have nothing but love for teachers. But I feel like, okay, so maybe that's just that's my own misunderstanding of library science.
I think there are a lot of really good social justice oriented librarians. I do not think there is a predominance of them.
Okay.
I know that library science is looking at things like collection. Um, I guess it's just called collection development, in ways of promoting own voices and promoting marginalized voices in the libraries. So things like, right, if you have a whole bunch of picture books and all you see is the spine, right? Those books, it's harder for kids to just stumble upon, right? They have to pull them out versus, the books that you put on a shelf and it's, sitting like this, right? Things like that is, that's very important in especially public libraries. Having public librarians that know the field and know the field of small publishers and get permission to buy from small independent publishers is also incredibly important. And so there is movement, but like all fields that are predominantly white, it's haphazard.
Yeah. Shayna, hi Shayna, is asking about, she's teaching children's literature next semester. Well, so now I want to know everything about that. Can I take that class with you? But so anyway, Shayna's asking if we teach from a textbook or only pull resources from the sites that we mentioned.
I have not found a textbook that I'm happy with. And so I pull from those particular resources. I read a lot of children's literature trade, like the Hornbook and School Library Journal, and not so much Booklist. Those are pretty much the two that I read. And I also read Children's Literature Association. I do a lot of work online. I do a lot of work. I have a tremendous community on Twitter of children's literature scholars, and they include librarians, scholars like myself, and classroom teachers, right? And so there's a tremendous amount to be learned online as well.
Here's a question. I think of books with animal characters and human characters as two separate categories. Yes, same. I understand it is still important to look for racist stereotypes, etc., with animal characters. Right, Skippyjon is such a good example of this. But are animal character books in general okay, as long as we are reading plenty of books with diverse human characters as well?
So, look, let's just admit it. Our society is racist, sexist, homophobic, ableist, pretty monotheistic. We're pretty much trash, right? And so our literature reflects all those isms, right? I have not done this work yet, but there is some work in media studies, in generalized media studies, that looks at the way that children read animal characters. And if you want to get the expert on this, Edie Campbell, she has a great blog called Crazy Quilts, although she really focuses on YA literature. She has a subset where she's looking at representation of the use of anthropomorphized monkeys. I'm waiting for the interpreter. Mm-hmm. Good. And the ways that those are read as and are used as tropes for African Americans, So there is absolutely a very direct link between anthropomorphized monkeys and anti-Blackness. It's a direct line, and she draws it very, very clearly. What I've seen in my own work, with kids is that they really do read most animals as white, with the exception of monkeys and pandas, which are all Asian. That's the general Asian. Bands of pandas running around Tokyo.
I'm mindful of time. It's 4:00. Do we keep going with the questions?
I don't know.
Somebody asked if there's a good site we recommend for diverse online books during remote learning.
Oh, that's a great question. I have no idea.
You know who knows this is Elena Forzani, our colleague at BU, is very much an expert in digital tools to support literacy development. I don't know about diverse online books, but I feel like you could probably do some cross-referencing of the resources that are making books available online, and then the books that are on some of these lists that we posted on the slide, but that will go out afterwards. But I don't know about one sort of clearinghouse of like, here's all the really good online books that also sort of check the criteria for diversity.
Right. So as Andrea said, we had an hour of your time and we really appreciate it. We will try to add some resources to that last page before we send it out to y'all. I want to thank the ASL interpreters. Couldn't do it without you. Hopefully in the future, I'm hoping to work with Anne Lazat, who is the author of Show Me a Sign, which is a fabulous elementary grade novel about a deaf girl in an adventure that she has. It's historical fiction. I still think there should have been a harpoon magically appear at the end, but Anne didn't do that, and that's fine. That's fine. That's fine. Andrea, what do you want to say in closing?
I just want to say thank you to everybody for being here. It actually is like super promising that there's a large group of people who are interested in this, and that Laura and I hope to do a second one of these soon to talk about like instructional implications. And so thanks for all the questions, because these are things that we can think of to include in an upcoming session or sessions. So thanks for being here, and please feel free to reach out to us if you have follow-up questions.